Water rushed off. Erosion was incredible. These pictures show the Canyon Lake dam flood in New Braunfels, Texas, just in 2002. The water went over the top of the spillway from the flood water, and boy, it carved out canyons, washed out road beds in a real big hurry. Anybody who's been near a bad flood knows it doesn't take long for erosion to take place. And if you look out over the world, you can see erosion marks all over the place. I fly out west, and you look out the window, and you can see huge erosion patterns in places that never rain. Here's a slick rock in Arizona. Obviously, erosion did that. To me, the flood's the best explanation. When I flew from 3 days ago from Spokane, Washington, over to Seattle, Washington, you can fly over and see the Channel Scablands. It's unbelievable. There's the Dry Falls, Washington, out there. Largest waterfall in the world with no water going over it. That's left over from either an ice dam breaking, causing the Channel Scablands, or from the flood. This shows what's called the Three Gossips, the rocks formation standing up with John Wayne riding around there someplace. The textbooks are going to say it takes millions of years to form these things. And you can see the buttes and the elevated plateaus, you know, obviously erosion. You can go see Bryce Canyon, beautiful. I mean, it's basically wasted real estate, but it's, you know, beautiful looking anyway. They say it takes millions of years to do that. Here's a close-up view of the same type of thing. You can see the little spires sticking up in the ground, off the ground. They say it takes millions of years. Oh, there's my ink pen on top. I don't think so. There's a pile of dirt we had in the backyard. After one rainstorm, I went out and took a picture of it. Made what looked like exactly like Bryce Canyon after one rainstorm. There's millions of years of erosion along a highway built a few months ago. Unprotected soil erodes quickly. This evidence of a giant lake and millions of years of erosion right here. You can see the obvious took millions of years to form that, boys and girls. Oh, there's my glasses. Another close-up pile of that pile of dirt. Close-up of that pile of dirt. It doesn't take long. You can go out to Montana and see these erosion features that are just enormous. I fly out west quite often. I just look out the airplane and look out the window and see, man, there was a flood. But see, God doesn't want people to look at the erosion of the world and think flood. He wants them to look at the erosion and think millions of years, because He doesn't want them to come to Christ. Here's some pictures of Dry Falls, Washington. Largest waterfall in the world, no water going over it. Just incredible erosion features. You can study that for yourself if you get time to look more into that. Talk about the water was 300 feet deep going over that waterfall. Niagara Falls is about 4 feet deep, the water going over. 300 feet deep, water going over a waterfall. Here's an eastern Montana washout. It's interesting, most of the mountain ranges in the world follow the ocean basins. I think Walt Brown's theory is right on track, that the mountains arose, the valleys sank down, the wrinkling of the pressing of the plates as they're sliding would cause all this. To me, that's by far the best explanation of all this. Bent rock layers, as you see in these pictures here, rocks don't bend very well. Bent rock layers, to me, indicate they were bent while they were soft. During the flood, you'd get thousands of feet of mud, and then during the end of the flood, you get the crust of the earth twisting and contorting, and then they slowly harden and turn to rock. I was in Crystal Cove State Park in Los Angeles, California, a couple years ago. You can see the close-ups here of these bent rock layers. We got up and looked at them real close, like with a magnifying glass. There are no cracks in these rocks. These were bent while they were all very soft layers. If they were bent after they were hard, they would fracture. They're not fractured. These were all formed quickly and all bent while they were still soft, and then they hardened into rock. As the mountains arose, the valleys sank down, the pressure would cause metamorphic rock, like marble, like they make tombstones out of. That's a result of the twisting of the crust of the earth. Skeptics say, how did the kangaroos get to Australia then? I mean, if after the flood, Noah got off the ark, all the critters got off, but how did the kangaroos end up in Australia? Australia is surrounded by water. Kangaroos can't swim very well, they'll say. When Noah got off the ark, the continents were actually larger than they are today. Now, that's going to sound strange, but let me explain. The oceans were smaller because there was still a bunch of ice at the North and South Pole. If you froze a few zillion gallons of water and stuck them on the North and South Pole, that's going to lower the ocean level. This map shows England would not be an island if the water was a little bit lower. You know, the deepest point of the English Channel is 150 feet. That's twice the width of this room. That's the deepest point. 30 miles wide, 150 feet deep. Do that on a graph paper to scale. It's a straight line. You could actually walk out to Ireland and to Iceland right after the flood. You can see on this satellite view showing the sunset coming into England, you can see the continental shelf. The water's not deep. As you fly into Pensacola, you can see the water's not very deep out there, folks, for quite a ways out. Between Alaska and Russia, the water's only like 60 feet deep, the width of this room. All you'd have to do is lower the water just a little bit and everything's connected. So I think right after the flood, the oceans were smaller because the continents were bigger, because the water was trapped in the form of ice at the North and South Pole. If the oceans were just 10% deeper, this would be the beach right here. The world is basically pretty smooth, pretty flat. When I flew into Galveston, Texas, you get off at the airport, it said, "Welcome to Galveston, elevation 7. I thought, man, one good wave and we're underwater here, you know, 7 feet above sea level. Not much. Florida used to be gigantic after the flood. Probably the continental shelf is where the beach used to be. You could actually walk to Cuba, jump over the creek. It could be the Gulf of Mexico filled in a few hundred years after the flood, and water came pouring in as the Atlantic filled up. It would pour in and fill in the Gulf of Mexico, carving out the grooves around Cuba. That could have happened after the flood. To me, it's a logical explanation. Mobile Bay, Pensacola Bay, generally less than 7 feet deep. Sometimes when hurricanes come and the air is swirling the right way, it'll dry up both bays. The water sucks right out. Between Australia and Vietnam, the water's only 30, 40, 50 feet deep. Not much. So if you lowered the ocean level by freezing larger ice caps, you're going to get huge continental shelves connecting everything. So kangaroos, wombats, koalas, all these less aggressive animals, getting off the ark, they're less aggressive and they would tend to rather run than fight. So as they move out, they settle in and make a house, you know, and then the tiger moves in. Kangaroo says, "We're moving, guys. We're not going to stay by the tiger." And so they would tend to continually be at the front edge, at the fringe of the migration wave. It would probably take a few hundred years, you know, for animals to spread out around the world. And they would continually give up their territory to the more aggressive animals. And when they get to Australia, they run out of places to go. But by now the water's coming up, and pretty soon Australia is isolated. So the reason we find kangaroos in Australia is because they were at the leading edge of the migration wave, running from the predators. And then they got trapped with no enemies. Hey, big island. It's all to ourselves, guys. Let's go have some kids and grandkids. And then they're covered up, you know, with kangaroos over there. So it's not because that's where they evolved. It's because the flood's a good explanation for that. Kangaroo fossils are found other places, but they didn't survive in those regions. They had too many predators. So why do we have a continental shelf? I think the ice caps melting back explains the continental shelf, explains why the oceans are wider and deeper and colder from the ice melting back, absorbing the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Next session, we'll finish up a little bit more on the Hovind theory and then tell you the importance of all this. This flood is powerful evidence of God's judgment on sin. And if you've not trusted Christ as your Savior, you're going to be judged in front of God for yourself, what you've done in your flesh and in your body. You'll be judged without Christ. Man, I wouldn't want that. I'm going to stand there with Christ's righteousness on me. Say, "Lord, you better let me into heaven because Jesus forgave my sin." I'll cover more on that in the next session. Well, welcome to our final section of Seminar Part 6 on the Hovind Theory of what caused the flood in the days of Noah and where did all the water go? And why did God flood the world? If you look at this map here, you can see Minneapolis is about 600 feet higher than New Orleans in elevation, 670 feet higher. But Minneapolis is a long ways from New Orleans. Actually, it's 1,150 miles from Minneapolis to New Orleans, which means the Mississippi River, it starts near Minneapolis, has to flow 1,150 miles, but only drops 670 feet. You can calculate that out. That's a drop of about 7 inches per mile. It has to run a full mile to drop that far. The Mississippi River is what's called a low gradient stream. It's just barely on sloped ground. Now, if you built a dam across Grand Canyon, a huge lake would fill in behind it. If you built a dam across, the lower United States, you cover a whole chunk of America. All the Great Plains would be covered. But a large dam across Grand Canyon would fill in a huge lake, and Grand Canyon had to form quickly, as we can see from the evidence. The textbooks tell us Colorado River, over millions of years, formed the Grand Canyon. That is simply not true. We cover this in great detail on videotape number 4 of our series. Grand Canyon could not have been formed by the Colorado River. The top of Grand Canyon is higher than both ends. The river enters the canyon at 3,200 foot elevation. The top of the canyon's about 7,000 or 8,000 feet elevation. Rivers don't flow uphill. That canyon was not formed by that river. That river just flows through that canyon, and canyons all over the world are like that. Grand Canyon is kind of puzzling because it loops back and forth, but it also has steep sides. Now, a looping river, meandering they call it, is typical of a low gradient stream. It's just not moving very fast normally. Steep sides indicates a high gradient stream, like the Columbia River Gorge in Oregon, and between Oregon and Washington, where the river's flowing real fast down real steep ground, and it cuts a big, deep gorge. Grand Canyon has both steep sides and loops or meanders. One explanation of this is the river didn't do it. Floodwater did that as it was rushing through there after Noah got off the ark. One catastrophe can rearrange the real estate in a hurry. When I preached up in Alaska, I went to see the Carnegie area, I think Trinnigan Arms, I think they call it, where the big Alaskan earthquake dropped the ground down, 30 to 60 feet just in a few seconds. Just the point is, disasters can rapidly change the real estate. And Noah's flood was quite the disaster. Mount St. Helens was an example of a small disaster. My sister lives right near there. I just flew over Mount St. Helens yesterday. Mount St. Helens, when it erupted in 1980, it started blowing out the top, but right away the north slope blew out, and all this dirt and mud and ash went sliding down the countryside about 100 miles an hour. As the mud went sliding down and the dirt went sliding down, it melted the ice caps on top. Some of it blew big chunks of ice off in other places. But this released the volcano, and steam and ash came shooting out, and it covered huge areas of Washington state from this ash. You can see the ash clouds here in these pictures as it's flying out over the countryside. People were killed, about 60 people killed by this little, which was considered a small volcano. Here's a car covered up in ash, was buried by this really boiling hot ash cloud as it came over. They found people all over dead in there, 60-some people died. You can see in the photograph here how that the ash went all the way out to cover part of South Dakota with ash from Mount St. Helens. Most of it concentrated over toward Spokane. But Mount St. Helens is considered a tiny volcano by volcano standards. Compared to Krakatoa, Mount St. Helens was nothing. But even still, Mount St. Helens taught us some amazing lessons. For instance, the mud that flowed down sorted things into layers automatically. As this hot mud went flying down the countryside, it covered up and blocked off the Toutle River Valley. You can see in these pictures here the mud flows that flowed down. Here's a semi covered up with mud, got caught in the mud flow from Mount St. Helens. This was hot mud coming out of there. Mount St. Helens blew enough material out for everyone on Earth to have a ton. It would fill a 10 cubic yard dump truck every second, 24 hours a day for 600 years. Lloyd Anderson lives up near there and has a creation ministry, speaking on creation, takes people on tours of the Mount St. Helens area. If you ever get up to Washington, be sure to look up Lloyd Anderson or see creationism.org. It's not his website, but there's a lot of stuff on Mount St. Helens on that website. This mud flowed down into the valley, blocked off the river. It also covered up big chunks of ice that had been blown off the volcano. Chunks of ice as big as a living room were blown off the volcano and landed, and hot mud went over the top. Well, a few days later, the hot mud on the cold ice made the ice melt, turned to steam. Steam expands 1,700 times and blew out steam erosion pits. Here you can see the steam erosion pits with erosion marks along the side. Some professor is going to bring his kids here 100 years from now and say, boys and girls, this erosion took millions of years. No, teacher, this took about 15 seconds. The big river system that formed about a year later after Mount St. Helens blew is talked about right here. It says, the landslide of May 18th buried the river and highway to Spirit Lake to an average depth of 100 feet. It also buried most other drainages in the 23 square miles of the upper Toutle Valley and plugged the valley's mouth. For 22 months, the water had no established path to the lower waterway. Then on March 19, 1982, an eruption melted an ice pack that had accumulated in the crater. The waters mixed with loose material on the slopes of the mountains, creating an enormous mud flow. In 9 hours, while no one watched, overnight, the mud flow carved an integrated system of drainages over much of the valley and reopened the way to the Pacific. The drainages included at least 3 canyons 100 feet deep. One was nicknamed the Little Grand Canyon of the Toutle because it's a 1/40th scale model of the real Grand Canyon. See, the mud flowed across, stopped the river from flowing, lakes backed up behind it. Once they got going over the top, it cut through the relatively soft mud, just 22 months old, hadn't completely turned to stone yet, cut through that stuff like a knife through butter. It carved it out. Canyons eroded quickly. Here you can see a picture of the canyon, 1,000 feet wide, 140 feet deep, carved in 9 hours, probably less than 9 hours. You go to bed at night, you wake up in the morning, it's there. At the bottom of that canyon is a little tiny river flowing through there called the Toutle River. I would call it a creek, but they call it a river over there. Once water starts going over a dam, erosion can take place very quickly. Any farmer can tell you that if he's ever built a dam to water his cows, and the water went over the top of